Hey, this is Joe from SoFly, and in this video, we are going to export WooCommerce orders to a very specific custom XML feed. So to get started, we'll go down here to All Export and select New Export. And then from the pull down, we'll select WooCommerce Orders. Now I have a bunch of orders here. We can filter them down using pretty much anything. So for example, if I wanted to just export orders that were sent to California, I could go down here to shipping address, select shipping state equals CA. And there we go. We have 621 orders sent to California. I could add another rule. For example, the order date, I could say everything like newer than 2021 and then older than 2022. And that would give me everything that was exported in the year 2021. Whatever you want to do, you can add and combine as many rules as you want, using literally any data associated with the order, the product, or the customer. So I'm just going to keep this one rule here, and then we'll continue to customize the export file. Now, if you wanted to, you could migrate these orders to a different WordPress site. We have other videos on that. Check those out if you're interested in migrating orders. But for us, we're going to make an XML feed. So by default, we just get a spreadsheet, right? And the way this works is we drag and drop things from over here. So for example, like the customer name, and then we can rearrange them. We can click inside, we can change the column name and things like that. We can combine fields. We can make, instead of just first name and last name, instead we can add a field, a custom export field, where we combine the first name and the last name. And we just put a little space in there, call this name, and save it. And then you can see here, that's a combined field, right? Now XML works pretty much the exact same way. So we go down here to export type, then we select feed, and we get our simple XML feed. We can preview it. Let's clean up some of these. We'll preview, and there we go. That's our simple XML feed. And we have some options over here. We can change the root element to orders, the single to order. Check it out. There we go. Orders, order. And then, for example, if we drag in something like the product, let's say somebody ordered multiple products. How do we handle that? We just loop through them. This person ordered 2 items. This person over here, they ordered 1 item, etc. Right? Now, this is great, but here is my feed. This is my XSD file, right? So this is describing the schema that I need to replicate for my XML feed. Pretty complicated. And I'm not able to do that using the simple XML feeds, right? I just can't. In here, we have parameters. I have to put the payment transaction here in a parameter. Like this is just not going to work. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a custom XML feed. This allows us to write exactly what we need to do. So I don't find this to be particularly readable. So we should convert this to like a sample XML feed. So what I've done is I got one into here to ChatGPT, and I just said, make a simple XML file that uses this XSC. I even misspelled it, didn't matter. So I pasted it in and it said, certainly, here it is. So that's it. So this is what we need to make, right? So I need to make my XML feed look like this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to paste this in. Now you'll notice that we have a begin loop and an end loop. So every order that gets exported, it's going to go in between here inside this loop. So first I'm going to move this over. So we'll put that, and it's going to be right here. We'll put our end loop in. That's going to be right here. So everything in between is going to be exported for every order. So now let's get rid of all this. So the first thing we have to do here is we have to add in our order ID. So what we'll do is we'll drag in our order ID. And you can see here we have this tag. That tag is going to be the order ID for this order. So I'll copy that, we'll delete this line, and I'll replace it in here. And let's see what we have. And there we go. There's my order ID. And all the order IDs down there. So you see here we have the order status. So we have to put that in there. So let's find our order status over here. There it is. It's order status. And I don't actually have to drag and drop. I can just write it in like this. So we'll do that. Let's check it out. And oops, it says WC-completed because that's how WooCommerce stores its order status. But over here, it needs to say processed. So what we're going to do is we're going to write a custom function. So I have one here that lets me change my state. Let's make a new one. We're going to call this change order status. And we're going to feed it in our status. Open it up, and we are going to return. We're just going to use str replace. And we're going to replace WC-completed with the string processed. And then it's going to be our status. We'll place that in status. There we go. And we will close off this function. And then to call this up here, first we open a bracket. So everything inside these brackets is going to be processed as PHP. Now we'll call our function, which is change order status, parentheses, and parentheses. Now before we preview that, we have to save our function down here. Okay, and let's preview. And there we go. They're all processed. Now let's say I have other order statuses in here. And in my feed, let's say if an order is completed, it has to be processed. And if the order status is unpaid, WooCommerce stores unpaid in some certain format, and then the feed wants it to be in some other format. Very simple. You just go down here to your function, you create an array. This status should be that. Pass the data in, spit it out, and you're done. So this is like a really simple way that you can process all of this data with PHP functions. And you can do a ton of very interesting stuff with this. So let's continue down here. So product line ID. So we need to have our product items. Now, if you'll remember, WPL export is going to automatically create multiple XML elements if it needs to. So if they ordered multiple products, it's just going to make a new one for every one of those products. So we only need one of these, and we need our product ID. So that's going to be over here. We can use the product ID, but that's actually like the post ID for the product. Really what they mean is they want the SKU. So we'll put our SKU in here, just like this, SKU. There we go. Fulfillment status. Can leave this as shipped. And there we go. There is my product line item. I have two of them for this one. Here's my SKU. This order down here, they only have one product in their order, and there it is. Now, for the fulfillment status, by default, WooCommerce doesn't have a fulfillment status for products, right? But let's say that you're using some plugin that adds that functionality. That would just be down here in your custom fields. And let's say there was a custom field attached to the actual product. The custom fields for all of your products are going to be here. So no matter how you slice it, no matter where this piece of data is stored, no matter how your WooCommerce store is set up, you're going to be able to pull that data out of WooCommerce, out of WordPress, and get it into your export. So let's continue down here. We have our payment transaction ID. We should have something like that here in WooCommerce that we can export for that. So let's see what we can find. Let's go up here. We can check in other. Let's see what we got. Payment method looks promising. And transaction ID. There we go. So we'll put our transaction ID in here. Transaction ID. Close it with a curly brace. And we'll check it out. There we go. There's my transaction ID. Status completed. Now let's check out our advanced options. So down here we have our C data tags. So XML is pretty specific about which characters you can use and which ones you can't. And if you're using an illegal character in XML, you have to wrap it in a C data tag. This is extremely annoying if you have to do it on your own. WPL export will take care of it for you. So automatically, we're just going to do it for you. If you want, you can always wrap your data in C data tags, and let's check out how that looks. And there it is, right? So these fields don't really have any data in them because of the structure of my XML feed. But let's add one in here, right? And we'll add one in with an illegal character. So I'm going to call this element illegal. Here's some stuff to get me in trouble. And it really doesn't like those single apostrophes. So we'll just automatically wrap our data and let's check it out. There we go. Here's an illegal character and it's wrapped in a CData tag. So we can get rid of that. We don't need to show our CData tags in our XML preview. You can read more about this if you're interested. A lot of feeds are really specific about CData tags. Sometimes they want you to always wrap them in CData. It doesn't really matter. If your feed requires it, you can always wrap it. I don't know why you would want to never wrap it in CData tags, but feeds do all sorts of weird stuff. Check this out. This poor soul has to export this. This is not valid XML. This is weird. Like, why would anybody want this in an XML feed? But the problem with XML is they just give you the specification and then you have to deal with it, right? So we can just do that. We can just add that up here, right? If this is part of my spec, I can just add it like that. Yeah, it's not legal, but whatever. Their system wants it. Their system requires it. So we have to deal with it, right? So we can just put that in there and WPL export is just going to figure it out, right? So let's close this up. Let's close that up. There's a lot of interesting stuff you can do in here. And this video is going to give you a good overview of that, but it's no substitute for the documentation. And we put the docs right here. So this is going to tell you pretty much everything about how to use this. Everything in this video is right here for you to read. It explains how to use functions. For example, I used a custom function over here, right? Where I'm calling this function. Instead, I could actually just write that function up here, right? I can just put, since we're just using str replace, I can just go like this, right? I don't even have to call that one. So you can write inline PHP functions and it still works. You know, there's just a ton of ways you can do this. You can write inline PHP all over the place to do whatever you have to do. So that's about it for creating our custom XML feed. Again, documentation over here to help, how arrays and repeating fields work. The same way we saw with the product line items, where one order has multiple products, that comes into WPL export as an array. And so it's just going to create multiple order line items for each of the items in that array. So it has multiple products per order. It does that for all of them. So if they're for images, etc. Now, let's say your feed requires you to not do that. If it wants a comma delimited list of all of the, I don't know, for example, images, right? Like in this example, or a pipe delimited list or whatever. So by default, WPL export is going to do this. If your feed requires you to do this, you just use PHP. A PHP one-liner right here, and your problem solved. And then here is an example template. This is pretty much what I covered in the video. It just gives it to you in written form, and it's right here in the interface in case you forget. Super, super helpful. Okay, so let's continue. Let's run this export and see how it comes out. And before we do that, we have our export settings page. So here we have our scheduling options. Now, an XML feed is usually going to be up to date, right? It's usually a URL, and then you hit it, and it gives you the XML feed. To do that, to keep it up to date with all of the orders that meet your filtering requirements, you can set up a schedule. We have two options. We have manual scheduling over here, and this is where you just set up cron jobs. Now you can check out our documentation about cron jobs. The way they work is you set them up on a server and you tell the server every time interval, whatever that is, every second or every day or every hour, whatever, every second Monday, whatever you want to do, just go to this URL, right? And then that URL is going to do something. In this case, to set up an export with cron jobs, you have two URLs you have to worry about. You have the trigger URL. So this is the URL that you're going to want to go to with your cron job when you want the export to start. Every hour, every month, whatever it is. So this is your trigger URL. And you go to this URL, it's going to start the export. Now the processing URL, this is what's going to restart the export after your server kills it. And it's just going to pick up right where it left off. So you want to set this one for about 2 minutes is what we found is best. So every 2 minutes, your cron job is going to go to this URL and it's just going to check, has the export successfully completed? If the answer is yes, do nothing. If the export has not completed successfully, restart where it left off. And that's it. So you just set up 2 cron jobs for every export that you want to run manually. Trigger URL when you want to run it. This one every 2 minutes. Your export's not running automatically. What do you do now? You're going to send that data somewhere. You're going to give it to somebody. You're going to send it to some API. You're going to hook it up to Zapier so that you can send it to Dropbox or with an email or hit some external API, something like that, right? Anything. Here's your file URL. So this is what's going to give you your XML feed. So every time you go to this URL, it's just going to spit out your XML feed. The bundle URL, don't really worry about. This is for something else. This is a combination. It's a zip file and it includes your export file and a settings file for WPL import. This is mostly for automatically importing stuff. With the custom XML feed, it's more about trying to create an XML feed to fit somebody else's standard. If you want to just export stuff for the purposes of importing it elsewhere with WPL import, you can just use CSV is probably the simplest option. Any default is probably better. Doesn't really matter. And you can use XML if you want to. There's just no reason to. But that's what the bundle is. Then our other option here is automatic scheduling. And this is a service that we provide that costs $9 a month. And instead of having to mess around with cron jobs on your server, you can just point and click up here. And there you go. This export's going to run every day at midnight. I can run it also here at 12 p.m., whatever I want. And the reason we have to charge money for this is because we basically have to have these processing URLs set up, and we have to keep this connection open for every single export and import that's using the service. We have to keep that connection open the entire time the import or export's running, right? So it's pretty server intensive. It's a pretty complicated system we have set up. The platform costs a lot of money for us to run, so we have to charge $9 a month. You get unlimited sites, so it's a pretty decent value, but you don't have to pay for it. You can just set up the cron jobs if you want to. Either way, it's pretty easy to schedule exports to run whenever you have to get them to run. And for XML, I feel like that's pretty important. Although in some cases, you don't want to run it on a schedule. You want to run the export every single time an order is completed. So with this option, every time I get an order that's added to my site, it's just going to export that one order and it's going to do it in real time. Now, it's not going to actually, by default, it's not going to do anything. It's just going to update the XML feed. But that's okay, right? Because the only reason you would want to do this is if you wanted to send that data somewhere and do something with it. They have a bunch of options. You can write some code on your end that hooks into WPL export, and every time this export is complete, that code finishes. We have documentation about that on our website. You can also use Zapier, which is a no-code solution. So every time this export completes, you just send that XML blob over to Zapier, and then it does something with it, probably send it to an ERP or some external database, external service, whatever you have going on, whatever you have to do. But between Zapier and a custom script of your own, you can do literally anything with this data. You can send it anywhere with really not a lot of hassle. We have some other options here. You can export orders only once, for example. So if I had this set to run every week on a Monday, like this. So this runs every Monday at midnight. Every time I hit that XML URL that has my export file on it, it's just going to give me the orders from the last week. If I did it like this, so it runs every day, every time I go to that XML feed, it's just going to give me all of the orders from the last day. If I had this export orders only once enabled. So that's a pretty useful feature for a lot of people. Now over here, we have some other options. Only export orders that have been modified since their last export. Pretty self-explanatory. It's very much like this one, but it'll also include orders that were modified, right? The payment status updated, etc. Now the BOM over here, you don't really need to worry about this. We enable it by default for all the exports. For XML especially, Very few systems are going to care either way about the BOM or even check it. This is mostly for spreadsheet exports. In a few rare edge cases, I think somebody mentioned they had some issue, so we included it here as well. Don't really have to worry about it. Create a new file each time the export is run. If you enable this, every time the export is run, you're just going to get another copy of your XML feed added to your website. Now, this is probably more relevant for spreadsheets. If you're scheduling an export like you're probably going to do with XML, maybe not. Maybe you're just doing a one-time migration to some weird service that requires some weird XML feed. Fine. But if you're running things on a schedule, probably a good idea to keep this disabled, right? Because you don't want to fill your server with a bunch of random export files. But in some cases, people want them, right? Another one down here, do not generate an export file if there's no records to export. Pretty self-explanatory. You can enable that if you need it. And then over here, you have allow non-admins to run this export in client mode. So you may have noticed when we were setting up this export, we were able to put functions everywhere. We can just write PHP all over the place. And that is usually a pretty dangerous thing for a non-admin to be able to do, right? So in my function, all I did was change the order status. I could have had, instead of changing the order status, that code could have said, make Joe an admin. So if I'm a non-admin and I'm allowed to use WPL export, I could just make myself an admin. That's privilege escalation, right? That's like the worst thing you can have as far as a security hole. So allowing non-admins full access to WPL export, not good. Don't do that. Only allow trusted people full access to WPL export because they can control your entire site. Now, let's say you create an export. You trust them with access to your site, but you don't trust them with an admin access, right? That's why they're not admins. But you need to let them use WPL export. How do you do that? You enable client mode, go over here to settings, scroll down, and then down here, client mode, roles with access, editor, right? So as of right now, all of the editors on my site have access to the client mode version of WPL export. When they log into WordPress, as far as WPL export is concerned, the only thing they can see is manage exports. They go to that screen and then they can only see exports that I've specifically allowed them to see. And the only thing they can do is run the export. They can't edit it. They can't modify the settings, and they certainly can't run PHP code. So super useful if you have to let other people besides admins interact with WPL export and run exports, right? Pretty cool. Okay, so that's all of our settings over here. We have our export name down here. So I'm going to call this my custom XML feed. And then that's going to show up here on the manage exports page. So I know what I'm looking at. We'll save and run our export. And there we go. This is going to take a few seconds, not too long. We'll let it run. We'll come back when it's finished. All right. So our export has completed. We can download it here. And that's just going to give me my custom XML feed as a file version. But the cool part about XML is URLs, right? So here is a secure URL. And copy that and put it up here in my browser, click go, and you can see here we have an error. So let's go ahead and let's open our feed and let's see what it is. And hey, look at that. It's that weird XML stuff that we had to add, just like this guy. So this guy had to create an XML feed that isn't actually valid XML. WPL export can do that. It's not going to work in all cases. I mean, there's some things that you could do in here that WPL export could just not able to figure out what you're doing. But for a lot of things, it'll just figure it out. It'll just do it. So in this case, it did it. So let's go back and let's remove that. So the way we can rerun this export file is we can go down here to manage exports. We're going to go edit our template. We're just going to remove this nonsense up here. Okay. We're going to update our template. And let's run the export again. Again, we'll let this run for a few minutes. We'll come back when it's finished. All right, the export is complete. So let's go refresh this URL up here and get a fresh copy of it. And there it is. So our export has successfully completed. That same URL, all I had to do was refresh it. and it gave me the updated version of my XML feed. And this is all of it. This is everything here. We have our order ID, our status over here. We have our SKUs in there. We have our transaction IDs. We have everything, right? This exactly matches the specification that we had, right? Looks pretty perfect. So, other things we have on this page, on our export complete page, we have our scheduling options again, if we wanted to edit those. External apps, very useful. This explains how to use Zapier. I highly recommend you watch this video, exporting WooCommerce orders to Zapier. I mean, you can do anything with it. This has 500 apps. They actually have, I think, 1,500 now. It integrates with Dropbox, Google Sheets, email services, FTP services. It has all sorts of really cool custom functions for processing the data. You can create logic like if statements, paths depending on the actual content of the data you're sending to it. You can write scripts inside of it to send the data to like ERPs and HTTP post requests to certain APIs, and then do stuff depending on what the status response you get from the API. You can build full applications just by pointing and clicking. Really interesting stuff. And export, edit, import. This is more about if, for example, you wanted to edit your orders in Excel and then re-import them back into WordPress. Not really useful for what we're doing here, but you might need to, for example, edit all of your WooCommerce products in Excel. That might be easy, right? If you have to change all the prices for 5,000 products, what's the easiest way to do that? You go into WPL export all the products, dump it to Excel, make all the changes you want to make all the changes you have to make, go over here, import with WPL import, give it the new version of the file, click go, all your products are updated. We have a lot of documentation on that, videos on our YouTube channel. Check that out if it's interesting. WPL import integrates fully with WPL export. So that is all it takes to export WooCommerce orders to a very specific custom XML feed using WPL export. Thanks for watching. Check out our channel. We have a ton more content on doing stuff like this, and we will see you soon.